Laboratory Phoenix, Part 2. David passed the watchguard stationed in the basement corridor, walked through the open door of the laboratory, past the bench where a row of pretty technicians sat, making serial dilutions of bacterial and viral suspensions, through the glow of the sterilizing room, and onto the small inner lab where flasks of cultured media and developing hen eggs sat in a transparent incubator, and petri dishes flecked with spots of color awaited his inspection. Dr. Carl Haslam was standing at the workbench with a pair of silver forceps which held a small egg under the skylight. Gently, he lowered the egg into its warm observation chamber, covered the container, and sat down. "Well, here I am. What's gone wrong? Explain yourself, my boy." "Just a minute." Grinning maliciously, David took down a bottle from the shelf of chemicals, poured a colorless liquid into a beaker, walked casually towards the doorway as he agitated the mixture of hydrogen sulfide and mercaptans. He held his breath, then coughed when the fumes of the putrescence filled the room and drifted out the door. He locked the technician's room. "Sorry for the aroma, girls, but this is a vital experiment." "Can't you at least shut the door?" one called pleadingly. "Explain to the watchguard out there, will you?" Closing the door, he turned on the ventilator and sat down beside Dr. Carl Haslam. "Why all the drama?" Carl asked, baffled. "First you call me by emergency code, then you hole in like a conspirator. I'm beginning to think you're a great loss to theater. What's happened? Why is it later than I think?" "Do you take everything as a joke, Carl?" "Certainly, until I'm forced to otherwise. What's worrying you?" "I'm afraid of being arrested for treason. Don't laugh. This morning I received a message, delivered in person by our old schoolmate Lanza, to report to Leader Marley on Wednesday, and Marley hasn't paid any attention to me since he last inspected our lab years ago. For another thing, Lee Hachnovic is making a nuisance of herself with her curiosity about my affairs. If she wasn't so clumsy about her prying, I'd almost believe she was under orders to spy on me." Carl moved impatiently. "I hope you're not turning psychotic. You have a clean record, continuous production, and you've never mixed in politics. You never expressed what you really think of our leader, even to me. And though we've been friends since we were in med school, and I hope you never will. And you're making progress with White Martian. Why, my boy, you're all set. What's treasonable about that?" Someone knocked at the door. Hastily, David covered the fragrant beaker and waved it about as he called, "Come in." The watchguard looked in for an instant, wrinkled his nose, and quickly shut the door. Laughing, David covered the beaker and began walking about with long, nervous strides, snapping his fingers as he tried to explain. "I'm in trouble, Carl. I've run into something I don't know how to deal with, and I need help. I need advice. I need cooperation. I lived alone with this thing for 10 long years, hoping month after month that something would turn up so I could evade the issue. But nothing has, and now there's going to be a showdown." Carl touched his arm sympathetically. "My dear boy." "That's it," shouted David. "What's what?" "That's what I'm trying to tell you. Why do you always call me your dear boy? You know I'm a year older than you. It's just a habit, I suppose. You look so young. Your hair is black, while mine is nearly white. You're full of vigor, while I'm beginning to creak with middle age. I didn't realize that I irritated you with my little phrase. I should think that you'd be pleased that you'd somehow have managed to sip at the fountain of youth. David sat down on his stool. I'm not pleased. I'm terrified. What do you mean? I mean that's exactly what's happened. I've sipped at the fountain of youth. I've discovered how to keep people from growing old. I myself have not aged a bit in the last 10 years. There was a long silence. Carl sat unmoving, his face like a stone. I don't believe you, he said at last. It's no longer a question of belief. In a few days everybody will know. The proof will stare you in the face. And what will happen then? Evidence? Carl asked. I can't accept a statement as fact. Would you like to come see my mice? Come with me. David Wong hurried into the small animal room and paused before a stack of wire cages in which furry creatures darted and squeaked. You remember when we were working on Blue Martian, those peculiar mutants we found in our mice, and how I used 6 of them in trying to make antibodies to the virus? I remember, said Carl. They were spotted with tufts of white hair on their right forelegs. David took down a cage, thrust his hand, and brought out 2 of the tiny black mice, which crawled over his trembling hand. The right forelegs bore tufts of long white hair. These are the same mice. Their descendants, you mean? Mice don't live that long. These mice do. And they'll go on living. For years I've lived in fear that someone would notice and suspect the truth. Just as I, for years, every time someone has laughed and told me that I never seem to age a day, I've been terrified that he might guess the truth. I'm not aging. Carl looked dazed. Well, my boy, you've got a bear by the tail. How did you find the elixir, or whatever it is? You remember the early work with radioactive tracers. A couple of 100 years ago, that proved all our body cells are in continuous state of flux. There's a dynamic equilibrium between the disintegration and resynthesis of the essential factors such as proteins, fats, and amino acid groups. But the cells direct all the incoming material into the right chemical structures, under the influence of some organizing power which resides in the cell. Foreign influences, like viruses, may disrupt this order and cause cancer. The cells are continually in a state of change, but always replace their characteristic molecules, and it is only as they grow older that they gradually become worn out. Then, as the body grows old, become less resistant to infection, and eventually succumbs to one disease or another. And you know, of course, that viruses also have this self-duplicating ability. I reasoned that at birth, a man has a definite, finite amount of this essential self-duplicating entity, SDE, in his body cells, a kind of directing factor which reproduces itself, but more slowly than do the body cells. In that case, with the normal multiplication of cells, the amount of SDE per cell would slowly but surely grow smaller with the years. Eventually, the time would come when the percentage would be below the critical level. The cells would be less resistant, would function with less efficiency, and the man would grow old. Carl nodded somberly. Reasonable hypothesis. But one day, by pure chance, I isolated a component which I recognized as being the factor essential to the normal functioning of body cells. It hit me like a toothache. I found that I could synthesize the SDE in the lab, and the only problem, then, was getting it to a man's cells. If I could do that, keep the SDE to the level of that of youth, a man would stop aging. Since viruses penetrate our cells when they infect us, it was no trick at all to effect a chemical coupling of the SDE to the virus. I used Martian blue since it was handy, and its effects are usually brief. Presto, old age is held at bay for another 20 or 30 years. I really don't know how long. These mice were my first experiment, and as you see, they're still alive. Next, I tried it on myself. David put the mice back in their cage, locked it, and returned to the lab. Tomorrow, the whole thing is bound to come out, because Tanya Hachnovic is coming back. You know her sister Lee, gray, dried up, soured on life. Well, I've always been checking, and when Tanya Hachnovic walks into the Institute, everyone will see her as the same luscious redhead of 25 we knew 10 years ago. I realize that what I did was a criminal act. I didn't think the thing through, or I wouldn't have been such a fool. But when I made those final experiments, I used the Hachnovic twins for a controlled pair. You must have been crazy. Perhaps I was. I tried it on myself, of course, but had no bad effects except for a few days' fever. But I realized that without a control, I never could be sure the SDE was actually working. It might just be that my particular genetic construction caused me to age more slowly than average. So I chose the twins. To Lee, I gave the attenuated blue Martian, but to Tanya, I gave the simple blue coupled with SDE. The experiment worked. Identical twins. One grows old like other people. The other remains young. I know now, Carl, how to prolong youth indefinitely. But what in the name of Leader Marley shall I do with my knowledge? Carl Haslam absently twisted his white hair and spoke slowly, as though he found trouble choosing his words. You realize, of course, that it is your duty to acquaint the Leader Marley with the details of your discovery, is it? Can you imagine what this will do to our society? What about the generation of children coming into a world where no places have been vacated for them by death? What about the struggles for power? Who will decide, and on what basis, whether to confer or withhold this gift? There will be riots, civil wars. I know that I'm only a scientist. All I ever wanted from life was to be left alone in a peaceful laboratory and let the other people worry about the world and its troubles. But now, don't you see that by the mere fact that I made this discovery, I've lost the right to sit quietly and let other people make the decisions? But David, you and I aren't able to handle such a problem. We're only researchers. I know, we're inadequate. Yet we have the responsibility. The men who created the atomic power probably felt inadequate too. But could they have made as bad of a mess of handling it as others did? Suppose I did turn this over to Marley. He'd use it to become the most absolute tyrant in the history of the race. Carl ran his fingers through his hair, smiled crookedly. Well, you could always start a revolution, I suppose, and start by assassinating the leader. With what kind of weapon? Men like you and me are not allowed to own so much as an old-fashioned pistol. Except for the military. Marley's the only man to wear a needler. And besides, I'm a research, not a military. I hate violence, and naturally conditioned against killing. Then you shouldn't have gotten into this mess. It would have been far better never to have discovered this SDE. I presume your notes are safely locked up, by the way. David grinned. Don't worry about my notes. They're written in Coptic. You remember when I was still in med school and made my first important discovery, how to prevent the development of hereditary baldness by the injection of certain pheromones. Leader Marley rewarded me with a free choice, and I chose to learn a dead language. Not half a dozen men in the world could read my notes. If your notes are safe, why don't you just destroy your mice and get rid of your proof that way? And the Hatchnovic twins? You could at least keep Tanya out of sight. Don't be a fool. That would only be a temporary measure and has nothing to do with the real problem. Lanza and Marley may suspect the truth right now, and for all I know, they keep such a close watch on my work. Anyway, the secret is about to come out sooner or later. Dr. Carl Haslam clasped his hands and stared at them for a long while, his lined face looking grayer than ever. He looked up at last, with a faint smile. Well, my boy, I never asked you to discover this stuff, but since you have, I hereby burn my bridges. You're right. We can't give it to Marley, but you can't handle it alone. What we need is time, and we haven't got it. We shall both be liquidated before this is over. There's no doubt about that. But we must do what we can. When is Tanya arriving? Tomorrow night, on the playground jet. And you see Leader Marley when? Next Wednesday. 5 days yet. Then this is what we'll do. Too bad Lanza is in the other camp. But there's you and me. And I think Hudson and Foray from serology will come in with us. We'll need other sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, the most promising material from all categories. If we're to create a new society based on the prospect of immortality. But I'll see the first two and bring them to your apartment tomorrow night for Tanya's welcome home party. I'll leave it to you to muzzle Lee. That won't do, David. I don't have a current free choice. But I have. 2, as a matter of fact. A reward for curing the insomnia of Leader Marley's wife. I choose to give a party. I choose tomorrow night, and I choose your apartment. A knock rattled the door, and the watchguard thrust in his head. How much longer is this here experiment going to take? Do you guys want to be reported? Just finishing, officer, called Carl. You can leave the door open now. What a stink, said the guard. Thank God I'm military.